The room went dead silent when she walked in, the way it always did. Not because anyone noticed Laura Bennett, that was the point. 3 years at St. Michael's in Denver, and she'd mastered the art of moving through corridors without disturbing the air. The fluorescent lights hummed their 60-cycle drone above the ICU as she clocked in at 11:56 p.m., her badge sliding into the pocket of scrubs worn soft from 18 months of overnight shifts. The hospital smelled like it always did at this hour, antiseptic cutting through something organic, something that lived beneath the bleach. Her hands were steady as she tied her hair back, pulling the fabric away from her neck where a thin scar ran from collarbone into the soft tissue below. The patch was still there, tucked inside the lining of her jacket on the hook in locker 247, faded olive drab, Special Forces insignia so worn the details had smoothed like water-polished stone. She'd sewn it in herself during a deployment in 2009. Nobody would ever find it. That was exactly how she wanted to exist in this place, competent, invisible, a ghost who happened to save lives in the dark. The night shift supervisor, Patricia, handed her the assignment without looking up from the computer. ICU 4 and 6. Medical holds, nothing critical. Laura nodded, accepted the tablet, and moved toward the unit with the precise economy of motion that came from a decade of operating in spaces where every gesture mattered. Her clinical boots, the same style she'd worn in Baghdad, made no sound on the tile. The ICU was running at 60% capacity, which meant the kind of relative quiet that let you hear yourself think, hear the machinery doing its work, ventilators wheeling their mechanical breath, monitors beeping their steady confirmation that hearts were still beating, for pumps clicking through their drip sequences like metronomes counting down time itself. At 12:34 a.m., the ambulance bay doors opened. She was reviewing Cole's initial vitals when the admit call came through. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole, 42, blast injury sustained in a training accident at Fort Carson. Shrapnel penetration to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Stable transport, multiple lacerations requiring sutures, hearing loss secondary to percussion trauma. Laura's pen paused mid-notation. Just for a second. 2 seconds at most. Enough time for her muscle memory to recognize something it shouldn't, shrapnel patterns, the kind of scarring that came from a specific type of IED fragmentation, the distinctive way blast wounds healed in field conditions when you didn't have clean water and you had to improvise with what you had. She'd stitched scars like that. She'd held skin together while rounds snapped past her shoulders and the medic beside her, Staff Sergeant Cole then, whispered the kind of prayers that only came out in the sand under enemy fire. He had no idea. That was the contract she'd accepted when the Pentagon buried her service record in 2011, when they gave her a new name in every meaningful way except the one that appeared on her driver's license, when they told her the operation had never happened and she was legally dead for 2 years and her clearance had been revoked so thoroughly that even asking about it would trigger a federal investigation. Laura Bennett, ICU nurse at St. Michael's, Denver, Colorado. That was who she was now. The captain was a ghost. Cole arrived on the stretcher at 12:22 a.m., his sister following close behind, her hands already in motion making signs that Cole watched with the intensity of someone listening to every word in a foreign language. The shrapnel had caught him from the left side, Laura could see it immediately, the way the wounds had tracked. The medical team was efficient but not exceptional, the resident, Dr. Khalid, called out vitals, the nurses began the admission protocol, and Laura moved into position exactly where she was needed without being asked, her hands already reaching for the prep kit. 12-gauge needle, saline flush, the smooth click of 4-access. She'd done this intense. She'd done this under mortar fire with rounds coming in from the north and sand coating everything including the blood she was trying to stop. Second line, she said quietly to the trauma nurse, her voice the color of calm water. Not deferential. Not commanding. Just present. Factual. The resident glanced at her, and she was already moving, her hand steady as a surgical laser, accessing the second antecubital site with the kind of precision that made something flicker across Dr. Khalid's face, recognition, maybe, that this quiet ICU nurse moved like someone who'd done this before. More than before. Often. Under conditions. Cole's eyes found hers for exactly 1 second while his sister translated something through her phone text-to-speech app, and Laura felt the moment stretch into something bigger than a second. His eyes were the same color they'd been in 2009, but they carried more weight now. The weight of 13 years. The weight of surviving things that had no names in polite conversation. She checked his pupil response, her movements efficient, professional, the 1,000 small adjustments that told her everything about his neurological status. No recognition there. He was looking at a nurse. Competent. Calm. Invisible. She hadn't served with him directly. She'd trained him, Ghost 6 training the medics before they went downrange, for days of field medicine instruction under conditions as close to the real thing as you could get without bullets actually coming at you. He'd been sharp then. Young. The kind of smart that kept people alive. Now he was deaf and scarred and sitting in an ICU bed in Denver, Colorado, with no idea that the woman running his intake had once watched him intubate a casualty with a piece of bamboo and a prayer, had told him "Good work, Sergeant, that's exactly right," had signed his performance evil with a rank that no longer existed on any official document anywhere on Earth. The first night was quiet. Laura charted with the kind of precision that came from someone who understood that documentation was its own form of communication, its own language. Every vital sign at the exact moment it was recorded. Every medication with timestamp and dose and route. Every observation meticulous enough that another trained eye reading the chart could reconstruct the entire night like watching a video. She noticed things, the slight tremor in Cole's left hand, the way he favored his right side despite the more severe wounds there, the careful way his sister stayed in the room even during the night hours, communicating through her phone's translation app and her hands. Family. That was real. At 3:15 a.m., Cole's oxygen saturation began dropping. Gradual at first, 96% to 95, then faster. 94, 92. The ventilator alarm stayed quiet because he was breathing on his own, but something was changing in his physiology, something subtle and wrong. Laura was at his bedside before the resident even noticed the trend, her fingers already assessing his breathing, the quality of air movement on both sides of his chest. The left side was diminished. Severely. Her pen wrote the assessment on the chart with a hand that didn't waver, decreased breath sounds left basler. Recommend imaging. Dr. Khalid ordered a chest X-ray stat. The images came back 12 minutes later showing what Laura had already known from her physical exam, a small pneumothorax developing on the left, the lung beginning to collapse, pressure building with each breath he took. Not critical yet. But it was becoming critical with the kind of velocity that demanded action now, before it became critical. Before it became a tension pneumothorax that would stop his heart. Laura was already preparing the equipment when Dr. Khalid made the call. They needed to manage the airway, boost his oxygen support to 100% non-rebreather and call pulmonology for thoracostomy placement. Standard protocol. The thing that made her hands move slightly faster was the way Cole's sister gripped his hand through the bars of the bed rail, the way she made signs that his eyes followed even as he fought for breath. 20 years in the ICU had taught most nurses how to save lives. 13 years of operating in conflict zones had taught Laura something different, how to understand that the person you were saving had people depending on them surviving, and that changed how fast your hands moved. She had him stabilized within 18 minutes. Oxygen support maximized. A second full line running normal saline wide open, just in case. Continuous monitoring. Cole's oxygen saturation climbed back up, 92. 94, 96. His sister made a sign, something that looked like gratitude even if Laura couldn't read sign language. She didn't need to. The relief on their faces translated perfectly. Dr. Khalid was writing in the chart when Dr. Mercer appeared at the nurse's station, the morning shift supervisor trailing behind him like a planet in his orbit. The department head moved through his morning rounds like a man assessing inventory, glancing at charts, nodding at nurses, his eyes moving with the calculation of someone doing math that had nothing to do with patient care. He was tall, impeccably dressed, his surgeon's hands manicured, his watch the kind that cost what most people made in a month. Everything about him broadcast private school and family money and the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being the smartest person in every room he'd entered. He stopped at Cole's chart. Picked it up. Scanned Laura's documentation with eyes that seemed to be reading something underneath the words, between the lines where the real information lived. He looked at the physical exam findings, the vital sign trends, the medication administration record, and Laura watched his expression shift from disinterest to something sharper. Attention. Calculation. Concern, maybe, but not the kind that had to do with the patient. The kind that had to do with exposure. "This charting is meticulous," he said quietly, and it wasn't a compliment. It was an observation the way you'd observe that a video camera was running in your office. Laura continued what she was doing, preparing Cole's medications for the morning doses, her hands moving through the ritual without breaking rhythm. "Standard protocol, doctor," she said. Her voice was soft. Deferential. Not the voice of someone who'd once commanded a team of 18 operators under fire. Just a nurse making sure everything was documented perfectly, which it always was, which was the problem. Dr. Mercer held the chart for a long moment. Then he set it down, turned, and walked away. What she didn't know was that he was already calculating how to bury her. Morning rounds at St. Michael's began at 6:15, and Dr. Mercer timed his arrival to the second. He knew Laura would be there first, checking vitals, reviewing overnight labs, positioning herself between her patients and the chaos that came with daylight. She moved through the unit like someone who understood that hospitals were built on small competencies strung together, that the difference between stable and catastrophic was often a detail no one else noticed. Which was precisely the problem. He pushed into Marcus Cole's room at 6:23, deliberately positioning himself in the doorway so Laura had to step back. Cole's sister sat in the visitor's chair, her phone translation app open, dark circles under her eyes from sleeping upright. Their mother stood by the window, her hand pressed against the glass as if she could push through to the morning beyond. She had been there for 48 hours straight. "Nurse Bennett," Mercer said, his voice carrying the particular pitch he used when an audience mattered. "Perhaps you could explain why someone with your limited understanding was assigned to a case requiring actual medical knowledge." Laura didn't respond immediately. She was checking Cole's oxygen saturation, 92%, steady, the result of her own adjustments at 3 in the morning when she'd caught a subtle shift in his breathing pattern before the monitors did. She logged the number in his chart with careful precision. The night shift noted some confusion about his wound dressing protocol, Mercer continued, moving closer to Cole's bedside. "Basic competence, I would have thought, but apparently standards have slipped." He didn't look at Laura when he said it. He looked at Cole's mother, at his sister, at the invisible witnesses who would carry this moment into the hallway and then into break room conversations. This was how reputations fractured, not with one dramatic collapse, but with repeated small fractures, each one believable because each one was delivered with the confidence of authority. "We'll need to review your charting more carefully going forward, nurse." Laura closed the chart. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, a sound like insects trapped in glass. She turned toward the door without speaking, and as she passed Dr. Mercer, she felt the deliberate angle of his shoulder, the physical assertion that she was moving through his space, not the other way around. In Baghdad, she would have recognized this as a positioning move. In a hospital in Denver, it was just bullying dressed in white. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly, and the words tasted like ash. By noon, the fabricated write-ups appeared on the unit board in the break room, a public announcement printed on hospital letterhead, Laura's name prominent, infractions listed with clinical precision, failure to follow medication count protocol. Documentation discrepancies under review. Competency evaluation pending. The words were designed to sound official, which meant they sounded true. In hospitals, as in military operations, perception became doctrine if you controlled the distribution mechanism. Laura saw the board at 1 o'clock when she took her lunch break. She didn't stop moving. She didn't change her expression. She collected her meal from the refrigerator, a container of rice and steamed vegetables she'd prepared Sunday evening, and sat at the corner table where the afternoon light from the east window fell across her hands. The room emptied like water draining from a sink. First, the 2 day-shift nurses who worked orthopedics stood up, their lunch half finished, their conversation about someone's daughter's college decision abandoned mid-sentence. One of them wouldn't make eye contact as she passed. The respiratory therapist who'd been sitting across the room slipped out next, her coffee still steaming. A nursing student doing clinical rotations gathered her things with the careful movements of someone trying not to be noticed. Within 90 seconds, only one person remained, Emma Chen, a new graduate nurse in her 3rd month, who looked toward Laura with something that might have been sympathy or might have been fear. They were often the same thing. Emma didn't speak. She didn't have the security yet to risk association with someone Mercer had marked. She finished her sandwich in silence, her eyes on the table, and when she left 5 minutes later, it felt like an apology. Laura ate slowly. She didn't taste the food. She was calculating how long she could remain in the position of appearing to comply while maintaining the borders of her own integrity. 3 years she had built this life. 3 years of invisible competence. 3 years of recognizing which patients would deteriorate in the next 4 hours because she understood the language their bodies spoke. 3 years of keeping a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, a reminder of who she'd been when the world knew her name. All of it fragile. All of it contingent on nobody asking questions she couldn't answer. At 2:45, Mercer called her into his office. The office smelled like the leather of his desk chair and the faint aftershave he wore, something expensive that probably cost more than Laura's weekly grocery budget. He had closed the door, which meant this was going to be documented later as a private conversation, which meant he was creating deniability. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, but remained standing himself, a posture choice designed to maintain advantage. "Your charting has become a problem," he said without preamble. "You chart like someone looking for problems, Bennett. Makes me wonder what you're really looking for." "I chart what I observe," Laura said. Her voice was steady. The voice of someone who had testified in front of Joint Chiefs of Staff. The voice of someone who had ordered men into conditions where the survival rate was measured in percentages. It cost her nothing to be calm. Patient safety depends on accurate documentation. Patient safety depends on not creating complications where none exist. He moved around the desk, and now his hip rested against the edge, a gesture of manufactured casualness. "You've documented 17 instances of medication count variations in the past month." 17. That's either incompetence or paranoia, and I'm not sure which is worse. "The count variations are real," Laura said. "The pharmacy delivers in batches but doesn't always." "I'm going to stop you there." His voice dropped, which was worse than if he'd raised it. "Because what I'm hearing is someone who doesn't trust their colleagues. Someone who's looking to make waves. And that kind of attitude doesn't work at St. Michael's. It disrupts morale. It creates liability." He opened a folder on his desk. 3 sheets of paper, printed and signed. Medication error reports. Names. Times. Doses. Every single one fabricated. The signatures at the bottom were his own, forged in a style close enough to pass any cursory review. "These are concerning," he continued, spreading them across the desk so she had to look at them. "Morphine discrepancy on March 14th, propofol count off by 5 milliliters on March 18th. These are serious issues, Bennett. Potentially criminal issues. Which is why I've already contacted the State Nursing Board, and I've asked our legal department to conduct an independent review." Laura looked at the reports. She could see immediately where he'd changed timestamps, adjusted doses. A pharmacist would catch it in 5 minutes. But a pharmacist wouldn't be asked for 5 minutes. By the time any formal review happened, the narrative would already be set. Mercer had already made calls, she could see it in the confidence of his posture, the certainty in his voice. He'd already positioned himself. "I didn't make those errors," Laura said. "That's what they all say." He smiled. "But I'm sure your references will be able to speak to your overall reliability." She understood then. The references she'd built so carefully over 3 years, the volunteer coordinator at the community clinic, the physical therapist she'd worked with during Cole's intake, the retired ICU nurse she'd cultivated as a mentor figure, they would all receive calls. And they would all be careful in their responses, because Mercer would frame the questions in ways that made honesty sound like doubt. Do you have any concerns about her attention to detail? Ever notice her being secretive? Did she ever mention her past employment? The room seemed to contract slightly, the air pressure changing in a way that made her ears pop. I recommend you consider your options, Mercer said. Legal counsel might be useful. Or possibly a quieter transition to another facility where your style might fit better. I'm sure someone would take a chance on you. He turned back toward his desk, dismissing her. You can go. Laura stood. She took one measured breath. Held it. Released it through her nose in a way that felt controlled, military, precise. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that Mercer had to turn back to hear it. I have never in my career compromised patient safety, she said, and I never will. A single tear escaped from her left eye. Not from weakness. From the kind of pressure that builds when you've spent 3 years invisible, 3 years careful, 3 years pretending that the person you were didn't exist. From the sharp edge between who she'd been trained to be and who she was allowed to be now. She wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. Mercer smiled. That's what they all say. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next morning when Laura's badge didn't activate at the employee entrance, when HR handed her termination papers with Mercer's signature prominent, when she learned that the hospital's legal team had already been briefed, when board members who'd promised her stability had already taken calls from a man who knew how to activate obligation. She had 2 hours to clear her locker. The locker door swung open with the soft metallic whisper of hinges that had marked the start of thousands of shifts. Laura's hand moved with the precision of someone accustomed to putting things in order, stethoscope first, coiled like a snake that had been tamed through repetition. The ID badge came next, the one that no longer worked, that had rejected her fingerprint at the employee entrance like a body rejecting a transplant. She folded it carefully into the cardboard box, her movements economical, wasteful of nothing, not even emotion. The ICU hummed behind her, monitors singing their electronic hymns, the ventilator in room for 12 wheezing its mechanical rhythm like a man drowning in slow motion. Families waited in the family lounge, drinking lukewarm coffee from paper cups, their hope measured in milliliters of sedation and the color of urine output. The work continued. It always did. What mattered was that Laura Bennett would no longer be part of it. She'd received the termination papers at 6:24 a.m., before most people had finished their coffee. HR had handed them across a desk with the apologetic efficiency of people following a script written by lawyers. Effective immediately. For cause. Medication errors. Breach of protocol. Patient safety concerns. The irony had been so sharp it could have drawn blood. She, who had held lives together in sandstorms with nothing but her hands and the muscle memory of 1,000 field procedures, terminated for endangering patients. She had simply nodded, signed where indicated, and walked to her locker. The worst part was that she'd seen it coming. Dr. Mercer's signature had been prominent on the termination letter, bold and sweeping, the signature of a man accustomed to signing documents that made people disappear. She'd watched him activate his network with the precision of someone playing chess with people's lives as the board. Board members who owed him favors had already taken calls. Legal teams were already mobilizing. The nursing board would receive their complaint within the hour, not the one about the fabricated medication errors, but something far more damaging. A comprehensive complaint questioning her clinical judgment, her mental stability, her fitness to practice. By the time she could mount any defense, the narrative would already be cemented into the institutional record like concrete drying around a body. But that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part was that she had no defense. After the black site operation in Baghdad had gone catastrophically wrong, the Pentagon had ordered her erased. Service records deleted. Identity dissolved. She'd been declared legally dead for 2 years while they sorted out what to do with her. When they finally gave her a new identity, new social security number, new everything, they'd been clear: never surface. Never claim your past. Never acknowledge who you were. The operation was classified so far beyond top secret that even mentioning it would constitute a federal crime. She had no medals to show. No DD 214 to prove her service. No honorable discharge. Officially, Laura Bennett had never served a day in the military. Which meant she had no defense against Dr. Mercer's accusations. She couldn't claim her expertise. Couldn't explain where her skills came from. Couldn't tell the truth about anything that mattered. The Pentagon's order hung around her neck like a millstone, and Mercer knew exactly what it meant. He'd probably confirmed it through channels that Laura couldn't even fathom. Lawyers and administrators whispering to other lawyers and administrators, all of them understanding with perfect clarity that there was a woman in the ICU with secrets too large to tell. She reached for her jacket. The lining was worn soft from 3 years of wear, the collar fraying at the edges. Sewn inside, where no one would see it, was the faded unit patch from her time with the 5th Special Forces Group. A small piece of cloth that represented 18 years of her life, reduced to something she had to hide in the darkness like contraband. The intercom crackled. Code Blue. Trauma Bay 4. Laura's hand stilled on the fabric of her jacket. Another alarm. Another patient. Another nurse would respond. Another doctor would take the lead. The system would continue without her, as systems do, indifferent to the individual bodies that powered them. Then came a sound that stopped her breathing. Room for 12. Cole's room. The monitor's alarm wasn't the gentle reminder of a slightly elevated heart rate. This was the staccato scream of rapid decompensation, that particular shriek that meant the patient was actively dying, oxygen dropping like a stone down a well. Through the glass partition, Laura saw it immediately. Tension pneumothorax. Cole's chest rising asymmetrically, the left side barely moving while the right expanded as if trying to compensate for the air flooding into the pleural space. His lung collapsing in real time, each breath making it worse instead of better. The pressure building, not just around the lung but against his heart, compressing the chambers, cutting off return flow. Pulsus paradoxus. Hypertension. The cascade that ended in cardiac arrest if no one stopped it in the next 90 seconds. The on-call resident stood frozen at Cole's bedside, hands hovering above the crash cart like a pianist who'd forgotten the music. His mouth was moving. Words that didn't connect to action. Cole's sister was screaming into her phone for someone to translate what was happening, her voice carrying the particular terror of someone watching their sibling die in a room full of people who seemed to be doing nothing at all. Other nurses were moving, but slowly. Following protocols. Calling for backup. Waiting for orders from a frozen resident and a department head who was deliberately taking his time in the medication room. Laura could see Mercer through the windows of the pharmacy, moving with theatrical slowness, letting the seconds bleed away, letting the situation deteriorate until even the best nurse couldn't save it. A perfect storm of incompetence and malice, a room full of medical professionals paralyzed by hierarchy and training, watching a deaf veteran die because the person who knew how to stop it was supposed to be gone. Laura's hand closed on her jacket. She'd walked away from this world once already, 18 years ago in Baghdad when she was supposed to have died in that operation. She'd spent 3 years at St. Michael's training herself to be invisible, to take orders, to accept humiliation rather than risk exposure. She'd built a wall between who she was and what she could do. The monitor screamed again. Cole's oxygen saturation displayed on the screen, 76. Falling. 73, 69. His sister's voice cracked into something barely human. There was no choice, really. There had never been a choice. Not since the moment she recognized the shrapnel scars on his chest and knew exactly who he was. Not since she understood that some debts transcended everything else, including survival. She dropped the jacket. Her badge was still in the locker, but her hands didn't need authorization. They needed muscle memory and the knowledge of exactly where the needle went, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, a 14-gauge angiocath that would let the pressure release and let him breathe again. Her feet moved toward the room before her mind had fully committed to the consequences. The ICU door opened before she reached it. Mercer stood in the threshold, his presence making the air pressure change, his face registering the calculation of what was about to happen. He saw her moving toward Cole's room. Saw the resident still frozen. Saw the moment when he realized that Laura was about to walk across a line that would destroy his entire plan. He moved to block the door. "I don't think so, Ms. Bennett. You are no longer employed here." His voice was calm. That was the thing that made it worse. The voice of someone who'd already calculated the angles, who knew that if Laura crossed this threshold, she would be trespassing, that her actions would become grounds for assault charges, that Mercer could have security arrest her before she even reached Cole's bed. His presence was like a gate made of institutional weight, the full apparatus of the hospital behind him. Laura stopped. 3 feet from Cole's room. Close enough to see the oxygen readout, 64 now, his color shifting into the blue-gray of someone whose cells were suffocating. Cole's sister was still screaming. The resident was still frozen. Mercer was still breathing, still smiling, still confident in the architecture of power. For a moment, the only sound was the monitor. Its scream. Its relentless mathematical evidence of what was happening inside Cole's chest. Then Laura's voice cut through it, not loud, not desperate, but something else entirely. Something that came from the same place that had trained 73 soldiers in a forward operating base while conducting search and rescue operations in Helmand Province. A voice that had ordered men through doors knowing some of them wouldn't come back. A voice that had memorized its own evacuation, years ago, when she was declared dead by the Pentagon and given instructions to disappear. "Move, Doctor." Not a request. The tone made that clear. Not negotiation or pleading or the voice of an employee asking permission. The kind of voice that came with the weight of command, the kind that made systems respond before logic could interfere. Mercer's smile faltered. For just a moment. Because he heard it too. The shift. The transformation. Whatever was standing 3 feet away from him was no longer the quiet woman in the ICU. Whatever had emerged was something else entirely, something that made even his carefully constructed authority feel thin and permeable as paper. The alarms didn't sound like warnings. They sounded like execution orders. Laura's hands froze mid-motion, a scrub top suspended above the nearly empty locker. The pitch was high and sustained, the kind that meant a body was failing in real time. She knew that sound the way soldiers know incoming artillery. She knew what it meant. She stood in the break room 2 floors below, her personal items scattered across her lap, a coffee mug with a faded hospital logo, a paperback novel spine-cracked from overnight shifts, the faded unit patch she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining for 17 years. The building swallowed her presence the way it swallowed everything. 1 hour into termination. 2 hours until security would make sure she never walked these corridors again. The code alarm shrieked again. Once. Twice. The sound climbed through the ceiling tiles like something alive and desperate. Every ICU nurse in the hospital would be running. Every resident within earshot would be moving toward that sound. It was what they trained for. What they lived for. The moment when everything else stopped and only the patient mattered. Laura's body moved before her mind caught up. She dropped the bag. The mug shattered against the linoleum, coffee spreading like a small dark stain, and she was already moving, not walking, moving the way soldiers move when they recognize the sound of their brothers dying. The stairwell door hit the wall hard enough to bounce. 2 flights up, her legs remembering terrain that had nothing to do with hospitals. Through the double doors. The ICU lay ahead like muscle memory in brick and glass. The resident was frozen. She could see him through the room's glass wall before she reached the doorway, Dr. Chowdhury, fresh out of his internal medicine rotation, hands hovering over Marcus Cole's chest like he was holding something that might shatter. Cole's oxygen saturation was cascading downward. The monitor screamed the numbers, 92, 88, 82. His left lung had collapsed. The pressure inside his chest cavity was crushing his heart. Tension pneumothorax. The resident's protocol training had locked up the same way his hands had. Cole's eyes were wide. Not afraid. Awake. Drowning in the bed. Laura moved past the resident without speaking. Her hands were already locating the anatomical landmarks, the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the exact geography of where a needle had to go. Time didn't slow down for her. Time sped up. Everything else became background noise. 14-gauge angiocath. Her voice was different now. Lower. Precise the way a surgical instrument is precise. Hand it to me. The resident was still frozen. A nurse, Chen, the one who'd stopped speaking to her 3 days ago, grabbed the needle from the crash cart and placed it in Laura's palm. Their hands didn't touch. Chen's movements were mechanical, shocked, like her body was obeying muscle memory while her mind was still processing. Laura's hands moved on their own. The needle went in with the certainty of someone who had done this under fire, under rain, under the kind of pressure that made hospitals feel like luxury. The hiss of air escaping sounded like a sigh of relief. The pressure inside Cole's chest released. His oxygen saturation stopped falling. 92, 95. 98. His chest wall moved symmetrically again. Both lungs inflating. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator like two dancers finding their rhythm after years apart. 30 seconds. That was all it took. Cole's eyes found hers across the small space of the room. Recognition flickered through his expression, not conscious recognition, not yet, but something deeper. Something in his nervous system that remembered her hands. That remembered being pulled from rubble by those same hands, in another lifetime, when she was someone he'd known. The resident started stammering. Words. Apologies. Excuses about the protocol and the moment and how he'd been trying to call for help and Laura didn't hear him. What she heard was the elevator chime in the corridor. What she heard was the specific rhythm of footsteps that meant rage moving at hospital administrator speed. What she heard was Dr. Mercer's breathing, audible and labored, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed world was about to fracture. The door burst open and his face was purple. Not flushed. Purple. The color of blood vessels straining against the pressure of fury. You were terminated. His voice cracked on the word like he'd screamed it so many times this week it had worn grooves in his throat. You have no authority here. You have no credentials. I want security in this room now. Laura turned to face him. Her hands were still elevated, still in sterile position from the procedure. The needle angiocath was in place. The tubing was secured. Cole was breathing. Oxygen saturation stable at 99%. The patient's lung was collapsing, she said. Her voice was quiet. Tension pneumothorax. He would have coded in the next 60 seconds. I don't care what happened. You don't work here. You're not licensed to. He's breathing. Laura didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. That's what matters. Mercer physically positioned himself between Laura and Cole's bed, his body blocking her access like a wall made of authority and rage. His hands were balled into fists. For a moment, she thought he might actually strike her. His chest was heaving. He was holding his breath, the kind of breath-holding that came right before a man broke. Get her out. He was speaking to someone behind him now, his eyes still fixed on Laura. Get her out of my hospital. Now. Security arrived in 3 minutes. She counted the time the way soldiers count ammunition. 2 officers in blue uniforms, hands resting near their belts in that practice-neutral way. They didn't look at her with malice. They looked at her the way security always looked at situations that had become above their pay grade, apologetic, professional, locked into procedure. We're going to need you to leave the premises. The older one had kind eyes. That made it worse somehow. The patient needed immediate intervention, Laura said. His life was in danger. I understand. But Dr. Mercer has made it clear you're not authorized to be here. We need to escort you out." She didn't resist. Resistance would have made it harder for them. They walked her down the corridor, the same corridor where she'd walked 10,000 times over 3 years, where she'd known every squeaky tile and every corner where the fluorescent lights flickered in a pattern like Morse code. Staff members watched from their stations. Some looked away. Some looked at her like they were trying to memorize her face before she disappeared. Mercer followed them into the elevator. His lawyer was already on speakerphone, voice tinny through the speaker but audible and precise. "We're documenting this incident as an authorized practice of medicine," the lawyer was saying. "We're filing supplementary paperwork with the State Nursing Board. This gives us additional grounds for the license investigation. She performed a procedure without authorization on hospital property after being terminated. That's not just a violation of hospital policy, that's a violation of state medical code. She saved his life." It was Chen, from the ICU doorway, speaking into the tense silence of the elevator. Nobody responded. The parking lot was late afternoon, the Denver sun turning everything amber and brutal. The air smelled like hot asphalt and the particular staleness of a place where too many cars idled. Laura walked toward the street. Mercer followed her to the edge of hospital property, his voice cutting through the open air like a knife through silk. "If you ever step foot on this hospital property again, we will have you arrested. My lawyer is already preparing a restraining order. You're banned from St. Michael's effective immediately. And if you practice any form of medicine again without explicit authorization." I was saving a life. Laura didn't turn around. "That patient was dying. That's not your concern anymore." His voice had dropped to something quieter, something more dangerous. "You don't work here. You don't have credentials. You're nothing. You're nobody. And you'll never work in medicine again when I'm finished with you." She kept walking. That evening, she stood alone in her apartment folding her scrubs for the last time before returning them to the hospital laundry service. The apartment was small and spare, the way safe houses are spare. 1 bedroom. 1 window. One life that had never quite belonged to her. The fabric was worn soft from years of overnight shifts. The name tag was permanently faded, Laura Bennett, RN. The letters had nearly disappeared from washing and sweat and the simple passage of time. This final indignity, returning soiled uniforms like a fired cafeteria worker, like she was nothing more than a body that had clocked out, broke something inside her that enemy fire never had. She folded each piece carefully. Hospital protocol. Everything returned in acceptable condition. Outside her window, Denver's lights were coming on, the city transforming from day to something else. Somewhere in St. Michael's, Cole was probably lying in his bed, his collapsed lung repaired by hands that shouldn't have touched him. His oxygen saturation stable because of a woman who no longer existed. The Pentagon had declared her dead for 2 years. Now the state of Colorado would do the same thing, just slower, with paperwork. She folded the last scrub top and placed it on the pile. Her hands were steady. That was something. Her hands had saved a life today, and her hands were steady enough to fold clean fabric for return. She didn't know that tomorrow morning her 17-year-old son would walk into St. Michael's carrying a shadow box of medals. She didn't know that Cole would whisper a code name he'd only ever heard from one person. She didn't know that the Pentagon kept careful records of everything she'd done in Baghdad, and those records would surface like bodies in a spring thaw. She folded her uniform and waited for the next thing to destroy her. But tonight, in her sparse apartment with her faded unit patch still sewn inside a jacket she couldn't wear anymore, she allowed herself one measured breath. She had saved a life. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. And no amount of paperwork could erase the fact that her hands had moved exactly right when everything else in the world was falling apart. Her 17-year-old son walked past security at 7:43 in the morning, the shadow box held level against his chest like a sacrament. He was tall, Laura's height, her shoulders, and his jaw set with the same measured determination she'd learned in Baghdad before he was even born. The ICU nurse's station fell silent when he placed the box on the counter. Inside, medals caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. The silver star. The bronze star with velar device. 2 purple hearts stacked like echoes. And beneath them, a citation card in faded type, the words for extraordinary heroism under fire visible even from the back of the room. "That's my mom," he said. His voice didn't crack. "Her name is Captain Laura Bennett. She saved 17 wounded soldiers in a single operation. She saved a man in this hospital 2 hours after you fired her. And you need to see what you actually just did." Cole's sister was in his room translating through the iPad, and Cole's hands moved before anyone else in the ICU could process what they were hearing. His fingers flew through the sign language with the precision of someone fluent in silent speech, and then his voice came through the speaker, raspy but steady, "Ghost 6. That's Ghost 6. He was crying without sound, the way deaf people cry, shoulders shaking, hands trembling as they formed the letters again and again. GHOSTSIX. The call sign Laura had buried so deep she'd stopped hearing it in her own head. Until now. Until her son held up proof that some things couldn't stay buried. A 2-star general was in the hospital that morning, Major General Holloway, there for a donor fundraiser, a routine appearance at the kind of event that dotted every administrator's calendar. He'd been walking toward the cafeteria when his aide grabbed his elbow and redirected him toward the ICU nurse's station, toward the commotion, toward the shadow box now being held up by Laura's son with both hands steady as a rifle. Holloway was 62, with the kind of face that had watched 23,000 soldiers move through his command, and he recognized authority when he saw it in a teenager's eyes. He walked to the box. He read the citation. His posture changed, vertebra by vertebra, the way a soldier's spine straightens when standing before something sacred. Dr. Mercer was already moving toward them, his voice loud and edged with the particular venom of a man watching his world collapse in real time. He'd seen the video of himself screaming at Laura 23 hours earlier. He knew about the phone calls his allies had stopped taking. He moved to grab the citation card, to physically wrest it away, to perform the only action left to a cornered animal, aggression, dominance, the blunt force of institutional power that had always worked before. Holloway's hand moved first. Not fast. Just decisive. His fingers closed on Mercer's wrist with the kind of grip that came from rappelling into combat zones, from carrying wounded across kilometers of open ground, from 3 decades of command. "Doctor," he said, and his voice was the kind that made pilots check their altimeters. "Captain Bennett's decorations include 2 awards I personally witnessed. One in Kandahar. One in the Helmand Valley. So I suggest you stop talking. Right now. Stop moving. And stand very, very still." The ICU had 114 square feet of usable space between the nurse's station and the patient rooms. In that moment, it felt like nothing. Like the space between a trigger pull and impact. Mercer's face had been purple before. Now it cycled through shades of color that didn't have clinical names, not anger, not fear, not shame, but something deeper, the recognition that every brick in his constructed authority had been made of sand. He stepped backward. His hand dropped. His lawyer's office was already calling to tell him his retainer had been terminated. He would learn that by noon. A Pentagon liaison arrived at St. Michael's at 8:57, moving through the administrative corridors with the kind of quiet authority that didn't announce itself. She was Dodd civilian, 48, with a security clearance that could open doors Mercer's hospital credentials couldn't even approach. She met with the hospital CEO in a conference room on the 5th floor. The door closed. 32 minutes later, it opened again, and the CEO was on the phone with the hospital's legal team, then with the board chair, then with communications. The words Captain Laura Bennett were being confirmed at the Pentagon level. The code name Ghost 6 had been reactivated for testimony purposes regarding potential institutional misconduct. The confirmation came through channels that didn't require newspapers or lawyers to activate, the kind of channels that existed in the spaces between federal agencies, where a single phone call from the right office could reshape institutional priorities in ways that looked like coincidence. But it wasn't coincidence. It was accountability moving at the speed of government, which meant it moved fast once it started moving at all. Someone recorded video of Dr. Mercer screaming at the general. They didn't know it was being filmed. The phone was in a family member's pocket, the angle capturing his face perfectly as he shouted about protocol violations and trespassing, as he grabbed toward the medals with fingers shaped like claws, as he made the error that would define him. He pointed at Laura's son and said, "Get this unauthorized civilian out of my hospital before I have security," before Holloway's voice cut through like a scalpel, before the general's hand made contact, before the world shifted on its axis. The video was 47 seconds long. By 9:18 a.m., it had been shared in 4 military Facebook groups. By 10:30, it was being watched by active duty service members in 17 different countries. By noon, it had been viewed 2 million times. One of those views came from Dr. Edward Soren, retired Army surgeon, Professor Emeritus, the man who'd written Mercer's medical school recommendation letter 15 years earlier. Soren was 71, sitting on his porch in Boulder with his grandson showing him TikTok videos, and he saw his former student's face twisted in rage, heard him shouting at a decorated officer, watched him reach for medals that represented blood and sacrifice. Soren understood in the bone-deep way that came from field surgery in forward operating bases. Soren's grandson was still talking when Soren picked up his phone and called the hospital board chair directly. They'd served together in the Balkans, 31 years ago. They didn't need pleasantries. "That's Dr. Mercer on the video," Soren said. His voice sounded like gravel in concrete. "The one screaming at a general. Whatever relationship I had with that physician is finished. And I'd recommend your institution review his billing practices before someone external does it for you. Because that's not the behavior of an ethical provider. That's the behavior of someone who's been hiding something." The call lasted 92 seconds. The board chair hung up and immediately contacted the hospital's internal audit department. They arrived at Mercer's office at 6:37 that evening with a copy of his billing records and Laura's charting notes, cross-referenced against actual procedures performed. The numbers told a story that was impossible to misread. Inflated codes. Procedures marked as performed that hadn't been. Kickback arrangements with durable medical equipment vendors. Unnecessary interventions on 43 patient charts. The pattern was systematic, the profit margin was $372,000 across 18 months, and the flagging mechanism that should have caught it in real time had been disabled by someone with administrative access. Someone with Mercer's security credentials. By 10:43 a.m. the next day, auditors had assembled in the hospital boardroom. By 2:15 p.m., Mercer's office door had been sealed with evidence tape. By evening, the hospital's chief medical officer had filed a report with the state medical board. By the following morning, the board had opened a formal investigation into billing fraud, unlicensed practice supervision, and potential patient harm. The charges didn't mention the viral video or the general or the medals. They didn't need to. The numbers were the evidence. The charting was the testimony. Mercer stopped answering his office phone by noon on the second day. His lawyer's office issued a statement claiming he was taking a medical leave of absence for personal health concerns. The hospital board didn't argue. They simply suspended his clinical privileges pending the outcome of the state investigation. His medical license remained active, but inactive. The distinction was important. It meant he could work as a nurse supervisor, as a medical director in non-clinical settings, as an educator in controlled environments where he would never again make decisions that affected patient care. Within 48 hours, everything had collapsed. He stood in the parking lot of St. Michael's 5 days later, holding a cardboard box filled with his personal items, a framed diploma, 2 textbooks, a coffee mug from a pharmaceutical company with his name embossed on the side. News vans lined the perimeter of the parking lot. The local news had picked up the story by then, framing it as a national scandal about institutional accountability, about what happens when administrators prioritize profit over patient safety. Mercer's hands were shaking. His face had returned to its normal color, which somehow made him look smaller, less like a man and more like the hollow space where a man had been. Nurses watched from the ICU windows, the same women he'd humiliated, the same team he'd tried to bully into silence. They didn't cheer. They just watched. Vindication tastes the same whether it comes with celebration or observation. Cole's sister posted a video that evening from the ICU courtyard. Cole was standing now, weight-bearing on his own legs for the first time in weeks, and she was teaching him to sign in the golden hour light of late afternoon. The words were medical terminology: ICU, trauma, wound care, and behind them, a message that didn't need translation. They were building a new language together. The post went viral in deaf communities and military communities simultaneously, watched by people who recognized in that courtyard moment something about resilience that transcended disability and rank and the institutional systems that had tried to erase both. And somewhere in that cascade of recognition, Laura's phone rang. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.